The air feels different on nights like this. Heavy, close, the kind of air that makes silence sound sharper and familiar places feel just slightly unfamiliar. When the full moon rises over the city, its light doesn't soften the streets, it exposes them. Corners look longer, shadows hold their breath, and the routines of daily life, the small rituals people repeat without thought, seem suddenly fragile. For centuries, people have whispered that the moon is more than light, that it marks thresholds, that under its gaze, the line between what belongs here and what doesn't grows thin. We are not traveling far tonight, not into remote forests or abandoned ruins, but into places alive with ordinary life. Markets, the kind where footsteps echo in narrow aisles, where the air smells of salt or spice, where money changes hands with a rhythm older than memory. In Busan, a fish market with a catch of the day is not always what leaves the ice. In Chiang Mai, a night market so vast it bends time between its rows of stalls. And in Tokyo, a walkway high above Shibuya, where echoes follow the lost long after the crowds have gone. Each place is bright, noisy, alive, yet beneath that surface, each holds a silence that waits for the wrong moment to speak. Because under a full moon, something else is always moving among the stalls. Something you don't notice until it has already taken what you thought was yours. Story 1. The Silver Scales of Busan. The first thing you notice in Jagalchi, especially late on a full moon night, isn't the sheer volume of voices or the kaleidoscope of colors. It's the smell. A bracing, inescapable brine, a mix of ocean and ice, cutting through the usual city haze. For me, Ji-hyun, it was the smell of home, of routine. My stall, nestled between Mrs. Pak's renowned crab and Old Man Kim's perpetually grumpy octopus display, felt like an anchor in the chaotic sea of the market. That particular night, the full moon hung low and heavy over the harbor, an impossible silver coin reflecting on the inky water. It was busier than usual, a strange kind of energy, almost electric, humming beneath the surface chatter. I was wiping down my display, arranging the last of the mackerel just so, when I noticed it. A new stall. It wasn't just new to me, it felt wrong. It was tucked into a narrow gap between a kimchi vendor and a dried seaweed seller, a space I swore had been empty that very morning. There was no usual vibrant awning, no bright LED lights, just a single, dim, bare bulb casting long, wavering shadows. And the quiet, that was the other thing. Every other stall buzzed with calls, the clatter of scales, the haggling. This one was a pocket of absolute, unnerving silence. An old woman sat behind the counter, hunched and still. Her face was lost in shadow, her wide-brimmed straw hat pulled low, but I could feel her gaze, a prickle on the back of my neck. She wasn't selling anything I recognized, just one type of fish arranged in a neat, almost artistic pattern on a bed of dark river stones, not ice. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, long, slender, with scales that shimmered with an impossible, internal silver light, catching the dim bulb and scattering it into tiny, dancing pinpricks. They looked ancient. A few customers drifted towards her stall, drawn by an invisible current. They didn't haggle. They simply pointed, paid, and left, each carrying a single fish wrapped in plain, dark paper. What struck me was their demeanor. They weren't excited, or even pleased, just serene, almost blank. Their eyes held a distant, unseeing quality, as if their minds were already somewhere else. It was subtly unnerving, like watching a puppet show where the strings were invisible. As the night wore on, a new, unsettling pattern began to emerge at my own stall. I turned my back for a moment to bag a customer's order or fetch a fresh bucket of water, and when I looked back, a few of my best fish would simply be gone. Not sold. There was no money, no customer, no evidence of a transaction, just an inexplicable emptiness where a moment before there had been a glistening pile of freshly caught bream. It wasn't theft, not really. It felt more like subtraction, a slow, quiet, vanishing act. The clanging started around midnight, a soft, almost musical clink-clank, like delicate chimes, coming from the mysterious stall. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the market's din with a chilling precision. I tried to see what she was doing, but the shadows clung to her, twisting around her like a living shroud. I could only make out the subtle movement of her hands, almost ritualistic, as if she were polishing each silver scale individually. A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down my spine. One of her customers, a young man who looked too pale, too calm, walked away from her stall, leaving something behind. It was a shoe, a single, intricately embroidered silk slipper, perfectly placed on the wet concrete near her display. Not dropped, not lost, but left. It looked expensive, clearly meant for a bride. I wanted to pick it up, to return it, but something held me back. A cold certainty that it wasn't meant for me, that it was part of a different kind of transaction. I finally managed to tear my gaze away from the strange stall, trying to focus on my remaining customers. One of my regulars, a kind old woman, was inspecting a particularly large rockfish. "Something feels off tonight, Ji-hyuna," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "The air is heavy, like the moon is pulling more than just the tides." I nodded, grateful for a shared moment of unease. It made me feel less alone, less prone to imagining things. Maybe I was just tired. The full moon always brought a strange kind of fatigue, an oppressive weight that settled behind your eyes. Later, much later, after the last customers had dwindled and only the hardy night vendors remained, I found myself drawn back to the silvery fish. The old woman was gone, the stall empty, the shadows dissolving back into mere darkness. But on the dark river stones, left behind as if by accident, lay a single glimmering silver fish. Its scales caught the faint ambient light, reflecting it back, not as dull silver, but as tiny, fractured images. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. Within one of those scales, impossibly, I saw my own reflection, but it wasn't quite right. My smile was too wide, stretched too thin across my face. My eyes, usually bright and tired, were dull, almost glassy. They held that same distant, unseeing quality I had noticed in the old woman's customers. A profound sense of wrongness washed over me, a silent scream building in my chest. The next morning, the space where the mysterious stall had been was utterly empty. Not a trace, not a damp patch, not a stray river stone. It was as if it had never existed. But even now, when the full moon hangs in the sky, I can sometimes hear it, that soft, almost melodic clink, clank, clink, like unseen scales being polished in the deepest, most silent part of the market. And sometimes, when I pass by that spot, I swear I can still catch a faint whiff of a cold, metallic something. Not fish, not brine. Something else. Something that chills you right to the bone. Some things are bought and sold, but the price isn't always paid in currency. The market surveillance footage from that night, reviewed later by curious authorities, showed nothing unusual, just the usual ebb and flow of vendors and customers, and a single, inexplicable gap where my stall appeared for a few hours to be completely blank. Story 2. The Clockwork Alley of Chiang Mai. The air in Chiang Mai's Sunday night walking street market is usually a symphony of scents. Roasting meats, sweet mango sticky rice, fragrant spices. But that full moon night, as I, Liam, ventured deeper into the throng, a different sensation began to prickle at my senses. A subtle dampness, despite the warm night, clinging to the air, and an odd stillness that seemed to hum beneath the surface noise. I loved these markets. They were a vibrant chaos, a feast for the senses, but tonight felt different. The full moon was a huge, bruised peach hanging low, casting an unnatural, almost theatrical glow on everything. I was searching for a specific kind of antique, a unique wooden carving I'd seen a glimpse of online. The main thoroughfare was shoulder to shoulder, a river of humanity. Then, I spotted it. A narrow, unassuming alleyway, barely wide enough for 2 people, branching off from the main street. It looked darker, quieter, but a faint, alluring glow emanated from within. Curiosity, as it always does, pulled me in. The moment I stepped into the alley, the market's cacophony dissolved. It wasn't just quieter, it was almost silent. The bustling crowds, the vendors' calls, the distant music, all became a muffled, indistinguishable thrum, like the world was suddenly wearing earmuffs. The air here was cooler, heavy with the scent of old wood, and something vaguely metallic, like an old clockworks. And indeed, the alley was lined with stalls piled high with antique clocks, from towering grandfather types to delicate pocket watches. My eyes landed on a particular stall, tucked furthest back. It was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting dancing shadows. The vendor was a man, thin and utterly still, his face obscured by the brim of a woven hat. But it was his eyes that held me. They were completely unmoving, like polished stones, reflecting the lamp's flame without any spark of life. He didn't call out, didn't beckon. He simply watched, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, yet somehow encompassing everything. The stall was filled with pocket watches, dozens of them, all ticking, but they weren't ticking in unison. Each had its own frantic, erratic rhythm. Some sped along, hands blurring, others hesitated, skipped beats, or even seemed to tick backward for a moment before resuming. It was a discordant symphony of time, unsettling and mesmerizing. The vendor gestured with a long, slender finger towards one specific watch. Its hands were spinning wildly, clockwise and counterclockwise, in a frantic blur. As I reached for it, a sudden, profound disorientation washed over me. It felt like my internal compass had spun off its axis. The alley seemed to stretch, then contract, the walls breathing in and out. The light from the oil lamp flickered, lengthening the shadows into grotesque, dancing figures. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drum against the alley's strange, muted silence. This wasn't just fatigue from walking or the sensory overload of the market. This was a physical sensation of wrongness. I tried to turn, to leave, to find my way back to the comforting chaos of the main market. But the entrance, which had been just a few steps behind me, now seemed impossibly far away. The alley had lengthened, warped. The stalls stretched further than they should, the shadows deepening the perspective into an endless tunnel. I walked faster, then almost ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The muffled market sounds were even more distorted now, like they were playing underwater. Then I heard it, a whisper. My name. Liam. It was soft, intimate, yet it seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once, from behind the antique clocks, from the dark spaces beneath the stalls, from the very air itself. It wasn't menacing, not exactly, more inquisitive, as if something was testing the sound, trying it on for size. I stumbled, my mind racing, trying to find a rational explanation. The heat? Dehydration? Maybe I'd smoked too much of that cheap incense earlier. My thoughts felt sluggish, disconnected. I finally burst out of the alley, gasping, back onto the main market street. The sounds crashed over me, a sudden, overwhelming wave of noise. But something was wrong. The market was far less crowded, the energy subdued. Vendors were packing up, their faces tired. I checked my phone for the time. It was well past midnight. I'd only been in that alley for what felt like 10, maybe 15 minutes, but nearly 3 hours had vanished, and my phone, it was gone. Not lost, vanished. A cold, burning sensation on my arm drew my attention. I looked down. On my forearm, as if branded into my skin, was a single, unfamiliar, bare footprint. It was small, delicate, but the mark was distinctly there, an angry red against my skin. It looked like a child's footprint, perhaps. I tried to rub it off, but it was permanent. A chilling reminder of a moment that simply didn't exist in my memory. I never found that alley again. I walked the market street the next night, and the next. The gap where it had been was now occupied by a fruit stall, bursting with vibrant mangoes and durians. No antique clocks, no silent vendor, no echo of disparate ticking. Nothing. But every full moon, when I feel that peculiar stillness in the air, I still instinctively check my arm. The footprint is still there. A faint, pale scar. A small, permanent alteration to my own personal timeline. In that alley, time wasn't just bought, it was unraveled. I later checked the GPS data from my phone. The last recorded location was right at the entrance of the market. There was no record of me entering or exiting that particular alleyway, or of spending any time in the area where I believed it to be. Just a sudden, inexplicable jump in my movements. Story 3. The Shifting Steps of Shibuya. The air in Shibuya, late on a full moon night, often carries an electric hum, a palpable energy from the millions of lives constantly in motion. But that particular night, as I, Ren, made my way towards the elevated pedestrian walkway near the station, there was a different kind of charge, a stillness within the hum, a coldness despite the mild air, as if the usual chaos of Tokyo was holding its breath. The full moon, a luminous disk, felt uncomfortably close, casting impossibly long, skeletal shadows of the buildings across the concrete. I was tired, my limbs aching from a long day at the office, and the thought of the crowded train platforms below was unappealing. This walkway, a network of winding stairs and unexpected turns, was my preferred shortcut home. As I began my ascent, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of my own footsteps echoed eerily in the confined space. The walkway was mostly deserted, a rare occurrence. Up ahead, on a wide landing between two flights of stairs, I saw them. A pair of shoes, pristine, child-sized, red with small white laces. They were neatly placed side by side, as if someone had just stepped out of them and would return any second. Not discarded, not lost, but left. An almost unnerving sense of order in an otherwise abandoned space. I continued upwards, but a new sensation began to creep in. The familiar geometry of the walkway seemed to subtly shift. The angles of the concrete walls felt sharper, the lines too precise, almost predatory. Shadows cast by the sparse fluorescent lights deepened and elongated, distorting familiar shapes into something vaguely menacing. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue, my eyes playing tricks in the dim light, but the feeling persisted, an unsettling certainty that the space itself was no longer quite right. Then the sounds started. Faint, distorted snippets of what sounded like train announcements. But they weren't the usual clear, precise voices from the station below. These were muffled, echoing, almost garbled, as if coming from inside the concrete walls themselves. They whispered of departures and arrivals, but the destinations were unrecognizable, the times nonsensical. Last call for the sht line to the thump, thump, unmaking. The sounds were unsettlingly directional, yet impossible to pinpoint. I tried to focus, to follow the signs to my usual exit, but with each turn, with each new flight of stairs, I found myself looping back to the same set of steps. The red child's shoes, still waiting on the landing, appeared before me, again and again. Not the same shoes, perhaps, but always a pair of red child's shoes, impeccably placed. Each time, a new, colder wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't merely getting lost. This was a deliberate, impossible recursion. The light fixtures above me began to flicker erratically. Not the usual failing bulb kind of flicker, but a rapid, almost strobe-like pulse that made the entire walkway seem to jump and judder. Sometimes, for an agonizing second, the lights would bathe the path in an unnatural, cold blue, making the gray concrete look like bleached bone. In those moments, the shadows would writhe, taking on grotesque, fleeting forms that seemed to twist just out of my peripheral vision. My heart was pounding, a desperate, frantic rhythm against the chilling silence. A profound sense of isolation descended upon me. The city sounds, which had been muffled, now seemed to vanish entirely. I was utterly alone, trapped in this shifting, flickering labyrinth. I tried to call out, but my voice felt caught in my throat, a dry, raspy whisper. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the late hour. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 10, and opened them again, half expecting to be back on the familiar, well-lit path. But the red shoes were still there, waiting. And the train announcements continued their ghostly, garbled pronouncements. Finally, with a burst of frantic energy born of pure terror, I pushed through a seemingly flimsy door I hadn't noticed before, stumbling out onto a brightly lit, bustling street. The sudden assault of city noise and light was disorienting, but overwhelmingly welcome. I looked back, expecting to see the entrance to the familiar elevated walkway, but it wasn't there. Instead, where the entrance should have been, stood a monolithic, dark gray structure, its windows like blank eyes, its entrance a seamless, uninviting wall. The entire elevated path I had just traversed now appeared as a stark, unapproachable block of concrete, completely devoid of the intricate stairs and turns I had just navigated. The next morning, the local news carried a brief, unsettling report. An unusual number of missing person reports had been filed overnight, specifically from the Shibuya area. The police were baffled, noting that many of the missing had last been seen in the vicinity of elevated walkways and pedestrian overpasses. A chilling coincidence, perhaps, but every time I pass by that area now, I see it, the monolithic structure where my shortcut used to be, and sometimes, even in the brightest daylight, I swear I can catch a faint, almost imperceptible whiff of something metallic and cold. Some stairs lead to places that aren't on any map. The official police statement confirmed that 6 individuals were reported missing from the Shibuya district between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. that full moon night. All were last known to be within a 500-meter radius of the central station's elevated pedestrian networks.